NIL Now with Lauren Sisler and Kevin Jones.
If you want to learn more about name, image, and likeness, you need to go to The Source. The NIL Now podcast from Headline Studio and Reddit highlights the biggest storylines with comments from key guests in the college and high school NIL space.
NIL is not a cherry on top. It needs to be thought about as a part of these young men and women's future to, further their careers. You should be able to leave college with something.
Subscribe to NIL Now on Apple, Spotify, Google, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Well, what a bombastic way to start the week of March 27th as Lamar Jackson woke everyone up this morning as we tape this Monday with his bombshell of a trade request as he wants out of Baltimore after he and the team have not been able to come to terms on a deal for the last 2 years. What does that mean for the Bengals? What does that mean for Joe Burrow? More than you think. And we're going to talk about that right here. Welcome into another off-season special edition of the Strictly Stripes podcast. Muhammad Ahmad and Andrew Gillis continue holding down the fort. Mike Nizick will be back with us later this week. And Andrew, like I said, Lamar Jackson, who, of course, does not have an agent, has been representing himself, hasn't said much on Twitter, although when he does, there's always something interesting about it. But this was the loudest tweet he sent out in a while, which is that he wants out of Baltimore, that the Ravens have not been giving him what he believes is his inherent value. So, ironically, this was 3 minutes, I think 3 or 4 minutes before John Harbaugh spoke at the owners' meetings in Phoenix, and he played it off pretty well, I will say, with the coach speak of, we love Lamar Jackson, we're fired up about him, we can't wait for him to be back next year. He obviously hadn't seen the tweet, he didn't know about the trade request, so he just kind of played it off, I think, the way other people would have played it off, if they were in his position, because he really didn't know. But it makes me wonder, first off, I want your take on this. Do you think Lamar purposely waited to tweet it 3 minutes before that? Or do you think he didn't even know exactly when John was going to speak? Because I don't know how much Lamar knows about that, but do you think that was a calculated move? I just wanted your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it kind of felt, the coincidence of that, would be pretty significant if, he decides to take to that news. Just to kind of peel back the curtain here for people who don't really know, the way that the offseason kind of works for interviews for coaches is you talk to them at the combine. Once the combine's over, typically you get, maybe a free agency signing, if they do something big or they make a trade. But then aside from that, you don't really get to talk to them until you get to offseason workouts or the draft. So, this is probably, I don't want to speak out of turn because I don't know the situation in Baltimore, but this is probably, one of the first times that John has talked since the combine. So, that's over a month away now, or over a month gone now. So feels a little on the nose.
Yeah, definitely. And obviously, I think he really didn't know about that tweet. And he's not a guy who's on social media. He's one of those coaches who, you can look it up. He's not on Twitter. But I wanted to just kind of set that stage and bring this back to Cincinnati because, you could talk about what does this mean for other quarterbacks wanting to get deals? What does this mean for, Deshaun Watson? What did his contract mean for him? And, you could talk all about that. I know the Browns podcast people have talked a lot about that, and that's not stopping anytime soon. But to just kind of bring it back to, Cincinnati, there's really two parts to this. I think the first part I want to touch on for now before we get to the second part. The first part is, what does it mean for the Bengals from an X's and O's standpoint? Because you got to think about this. For the last 5 years, you've had to deal with him twice a year. I guess really the last 4 because his rookie year, he didn't come in immediately. So mostly the last 5 years, you've dealt with him. You dealt with him when he was an MVP in 2019 when the Bengals were rock bottom before Joe Burrow. Since Joe Burrow, once Burrow became healthy after he tore his ACL, they've been two of the better quarterbacks in the division. And now that you have Deshaun Watson in the mix and Kenny Pickett in Pittsburgh, who there's still more questions than answers as to what the Steelers are going to look like offensively, in 2023. When you think about the possibility of Lamar Jackson not being in Baltimore next year, which just in my opinion, I would like to think is probably not going to happen just based on the way everything's unfolded. How much does that shift the power dynamics in the AFC North not just for the Bengals, but I mean, with respect to the Browns, like how much does that shift the power balance in that sense?
Yeah, I think it's pretty significant kind of moving forward if Lamar is no longer going to be in the AFC North. I mean, frankly, it's kind of a weird situation, right? Because, when Lamar tweeted this, and we'll get into this later in the show, he tweeted that, the request came through on March 2nd. And that, I mean, as we record this, it is 5:00 on Monday, March 27th. So, I mean, you're talking 25 days ago that he requested this trade, and only today did it become public knowledge. So, there's a lot going on there, but, I think I just have questions if he's going to leave the division. But if he does, I mean, that's pretty significant because, there was always kind of I think even going into this year, there was a lot of, hey, how would you rank the AFC quarterbacks? And I think, I made this case. I believed it. I think you could make a case that Lamar was better than Burrow, or you'd rather have Lamar than Burrow. And I don't think that was necessarily insane to think. It kind of, to me, felt a little bit like a coin flip. You had only seen Joe Burrow have, one really, really good season. And now that you saw him get better in that third year, you saw him play really well, take him to another AFC title game. That kind of feels like a fantasy land, but it is unique because Lamar is really talented and he is the best dual threat quarterback in the sport. And there's really not many players in the league like him, like in the league's history. And when you don't have to prepare for that every or twice a season, that matters. Lou Anarumo talked about this during the year, like during OTAs and during training camp. Every once in a while, they'll have a Ravens day where they'll, they do this for all their divisional opponents. But, when you have a Ravens day, it's a little bit different because, hey, today we're working on read option. We're working on, different blocking schemes. We're working on all these different kind of things that the offense does. So it kind of changes not only the dynamics of the division, because it's really, really hard to find a player who is as good as Lamar Jackson, but it also kind of changes how you have to game plan twice a year, because it is just such a unique offense to have to try and prepare for.
Yeah, I mean, you just laid out the whole case there, but I mean, like, let's look at Lou Anarumo. Like, pretend you're Lou Anarumo, and obviously during the summer, like, he said this before in the regular season, that there's certain weeks in the off season where you plan for certain games. So 1 week in the off season, they'll plan for the Titans. 1 week they'll plan for Baltimore, in both cases, obviously, because they're a divisional team. They'll plan for Kansas City. So, like, if, we're getting into the off season and Lou Anarumo's like, okay, no more Lamar Jackson. The Ravens have fill-in quarterback here. Who knows who it'll be at that point, which is another conversation. But, like, if you're Lou Anarumo and you're planning specifically for the Ravens and your off-season set, how much of a breath of relief can you let go of, knowing that when you play Baltimore on the calendar twice a year, it's not like a gimme win, because obviously there's no gimme wins in the NFL, but life just gets a whole lot easier. I mean, what do you do if you're Lou Anarumo in that point?
I mean, if you're saying if Lamar is gone from the AFC North?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, you have to feel better. You kind of look like, because it's more, I think you can take this a lot of different ways, because, yes, you want that quarterback out of your division. Ideally, like if you're, if any team in the league would want this, you want the other three teams in your division to have terrible quarterback situations. You want them to kind of be in flux and not really know what's going on and not really have a plan. That would kind of be ideal, but it just kind of depends on what they're going to do in replacement of Lamar if Lamar does go, because there's a lot of talk about the Colts. They have the 4th overall pick. With as athletic as Anthony Richardson is, that kind of feels like a nice segue to keep the offense similar in style. So I don't think it's necessarily getting rid of Lamar is pretty significant, because again, there's nobody in the league that can do what he does running the ball. There's nobody in the sport that is as electrifying as he is, both in terms of the run and the pass game. Now, don't get me wrong. I would, that doesn't mean he's better than, Patrick Mahomes or anybody like that. But it depends on who they're going to replace him with, because, Tyler Huntley, they kind of ran a similar offense with Huntley back there. What if they do get Anthony Richardson, or, what if they do kind of bring in another, like, what if they trade for Trey Lance? Like, what if they get a mobile guy who can still kind of move around, and they're like, hey, look, we're going to keep the offensive scheme kind of the same thing. Then it's a little bit different. Then you're not really, then you're not really changing a whole heck of a lot, and you still kind of have those headaches. But I mean, you feel you have a pretty big sigh of relief for sure.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing about it, is like, you're already planning for Patrick Mahomes next year. You're going to plan for Josh Allen again next year. Whoever the Houston Texans take in the CJ Stroud, Bryce Young sweepstakes, you got to deal with them next year, because the Texans are on the schedule. So you could be going against CJ Stroud or Bryce Young in 2023 if the Texans lay any of those guys. And same thing with the Colts. Like, I mean, ironically, if the Bengals were to deal with any headaches from Lamar, like you said, it could be Indianapolis, because Chris Ballard, the Colts GM, didn't completely rule that out at the owners' meetings. There was speculation about that, per ESPN Stephen Holder, I think about a week and a half ago at this point. So, I mean, they're in the running. And then supposedly Meek Mill texted Robert Kraft, the Patriots owner, like that Lamar Jackson is interested in being a Patriot. How true that is, we don't know. But that's what Robert Kraft actually said at the owners' meetings on Monday. So, man, talk about an eventful owners' meetings. Like, there has just been no shortage of fireworks there. And I think the buzz with Lamar is not going anywhere anytime soon. But, as far as, like, kind of going back to the power balance equation, you think about a team like Cleveland, and I know this is a Bengals-centric podcast, but hear me out when I say this. You got Deshaun Watson, who's going to come in and play his first full year of football since 2020, because he didn't play at all in 2021, and he missed more than half of the season last year in Cleveland when he got traded there and signed his deal. I mean, you got Deshaun Watson locked and loaded. I mean, they just got Elijah Moore. They just got a lot of receivers next to Amari Cooper and Donovan Peoples-Jones. You still got Nick Chubb. You have Myles Garrett on the other side of the ball. Like, that's a pretty loaded team. I mean, does this maybe give some credence to where, okay, the Bengals aren't going to be as worried about the Ravens, but now you're a heck of a lot more worried about the Browns next year in terms of a power balance?
That's an interesting question, because, I've been grading as kind of a series that we've been doing. I've been grading every team so far in the NFL, just kind of based on the free agency grades. And you look at the Browns and kind of what they did. You bring in two defensive linemen. Dalvin Tomlinson's a really good run stuffer. You bring in Juan Thornhill. You trade for Elijah Moore. Like, the things you're doing make sense. And when you lay out their lineup, okay, their offensive line is pretty good. You still have those big boys up front that they make Nick Chubb's life really easy. Nick Chubb's still one of the best running backs in football.
Yeah.
You have a receiving core with Amari Cooper and Donovan Peoples-Jones, and now Elijah Moore. And Elijah Moore, it's crazy to say that a dude going into his third year is kind of in like a make or break year for his NFL career. But, this very much feels like if this year doesn't work, he might be in some trouble in terms of, the long-term outlook of his career, just because, things ended so badly in New York, and now he's got a really, really good opportunity. And I believe in his talent, and I think it's going to work. But, the Browns are weird because everything on paper makes sense, right? Like, hey, if the quarterback is good, like if the quarterback plays to what he is, he's really good. Same with the running back, same with the receivers, same with the offensive line. Their defense was not very good last year. They added, a pass rusher opposite Myles Garrett. You add run stuffing help. You add a safety. Like, you fixed the issues that kind of plagued that team, and I think they have 8 draft picks still. So you can look at the Browns and say that everything makes sense. Like, everything on paper looks good. But how that's going to translate to the field is very, very interesting to me, just because you don't know if it will. Like, is Elijah Moore the guy who kind of everybody thought he was going to be when he got drafted by the Jets? Because if he's not, I mean, the Browns receiving core is still kind of in trouble. Is Deshaun Watson going to become Deshaun Watson of 2019, 2020 again? Because if he's not, the Browns are in trouble. People are going to lose jobs. Like, it's everything on paper makes sense to me. But if it hits, you should absolutely be scared of the Browns, because if everything works out, that's a playoff team. That's a team that's going to contend for the division.
Yeah, and I think at that point, like, if you're the Bengals, and again, this is all with the possibility of no Lamar Jackson in Baltimore, which to emphasize, I personally believe is going to be reality. Like, I just think with the way everything's unfolded with his cryptic tweet, well, not cryptic because they've actually been pretty wide open. We'll talk about that later, but the tweets and then just the standoffs, not getting a deal for the last 2 years, and just, I think, and really the toxicity that's kind of come out of just all of this, I think at this point, it's probably time for both sides to move on. But yeah, I mean, if that happens, like, I mean, who would have thought, like, I mean, go back 2 years ago, like, so not before last year, but the year before the 2021 season, who would have thought that, like, at this point in time, we'd be talking about the Cincinnati Bengals and the Cleveland Browns, who traditionally, like, let's be real, traditionally in the better half of the decade, coming into, 2020, last decade, I should say, I can't speak today, Ramadan fast. I mean, the Browns and Bengals were the bottom feeders of that division. Like, you had, the Ravens had their runs with Joe Flacco, and then later Lamar Jackson gets drafted. He wins MVP. The Steelers still had Ben Roethlisberger. The Bengals were 2-14 3 years ago. The Browns had their first playoff run 3 years ago for the first time in 2 decades. And now you're talking about a world where these two teams could be the top dogs of the AFC North. Like, does that sound crazy to you just hearing that?
So it is kind of weird because, for so long, I think, the question is too, and I mean, this is, I think, something we can talk about, as the season draws closer. Like, for a really long time, the division of the AFC North was, okay, who's going to win, Pittsburgh or Baltimore? And then obviously, Cincinnati had a nice little run there, but like, the Steelers-Ravens was probably the best rivalry in the sport for a decent amount of time.
Yeah.
And now you kind of look at it and, like, it depends on what you think about Kenny Pickett. And I'm not a big believer in Kenny Pickett. I don't think, he's going to be I don't think he's going to be kind of a first-round talent. Like, I think he's probably going to be decent. He's going to be a fine. But fine doesn't really get you anything. Mike Tomlin's a good enough coach to where they can go, 9-8 in perpetuity. But I don't see them kind of ever being a true, legitimate, okay, this team is really, really good threat, because the defense is really good. The receivers are really good. The offensive line needs work, but you have Najee Harris, like, you have Jalen Warren as a 1-2 punch. Like, everything else is kind of set up, reasonably as kind of best you could get it. And I just don't think they're ever going to get there. And now the Ravens are kind of in that same boat where at quarterback, you're like, I don't know, man, that defense is getting older. But yeah, so I mean, the Ravens are kind of the same thing where, at quarterback, you don't really know what's going on. Defense is getting older. What are they doing at receiver? Like, it very much, I think it's kind of a changing of the guard between, not just, hey, look, here's the division, which, I mean, in 2019, if you would have said this was the way things were going to look, holy crap. Like, that's
exactly
insane.
Like,
yeah. Think about where this all was in 2019. Like, the Bengals were coming off of just a miserable season. That was like the tank for 2 a year. They were bad. The Browns were 6-10. Like, everything just felt like it was falling apart for Cleveland and for Cincinnati. And there really didn't feel like a lot of relief in sight. The Ravens had just gone 14-2. Lamar had just won MVP. And even in like 2020, I mean, it's still like that. The Ravens were good. They made the playoffs. The Steelers went 12-4. I know the Browns made the playoffs as well, but like everything just kind of felt very unstable in Ohio, and now here we are.
Yeah, here we are. And stay with us, because when we come back, we're going to talk about the other half of what the Lamar Jackson saga means for Joe Burrow, his contract extension, looming contract extension, I should say, and what the Bengals can take away from that, plus more free agency talk, because there is still a little bit of that going on when we return right here on the Strictly Stripes podcast. Hey there, it's Muhammad Ahmad from the Strictly Stripes podcast, and if you still don't know what Cincinnati Football Insider is, listen up. It's a community of fans who want the inside scoop on the Bengals and a direct connection to the podcast and the reporters who cover the team. Here's how it works. Andrew, Mike, and I will text your phone a few times a day with breaking news, analysis, and our insights on the Bengals. And it's the inside scoop on what we're hearing, and we're giving you the inside word before it even hits social media. If you join Cincinnati Football Insider, you get to participate on the podcast, and you can text us directly. It's a great way to cut through the clutter of social media for just $4.99 a month. Still not sure? Just try it for 2 weeks, and if you don't like it, you can text the word STOP at any time, but you won't want to cancel once you join the community of hardcore Bengals fans. So here's how you get on board. Text 513-940-4193 or go to cleveland.com/Bengals and click on the blue banner at the top of the page. It's a great time to join as we're covering the NFL Draft, OTAs, mini camps, and much more to come later this year. So give us a try for 2 weeks and see what you think. Just text again the number 513-940-4193. All right, and thanks for staying with us on the Strictly Stripes podcast. So, Andrew, we just talked a good, almost 20 minutes about, if you're Lou Anarumo, you're the Bengals coaching staff, and you're planning for a world without Lamar Jackson in the AFC North, what does that mean? And you really talked about the changing of the guard, because there's no more Ben Roethlisberger. He's retired. You might not have any more Lamar Jackson. And now you got Joe Burrow and Deshaun Watson. And like you said in your own words, holy hell, we could be here in a matter of just God knows how long until that actually fully becomes a reality. But we also, I think the other side of this that will become a reality soon is, Joe Burrow is due for a contract extension. And it's almost guaranteed to say that he will get paid. How much he gets paid, what that looks like, completely up in the air. No one even truly knows at this point. But we do know that there will be a payday. And so if you look at just a lot of the, you want to call it the kinks and bolts of just the Lamar Jackson saga. And there is a lot to talk about because I don't think we've ever seen anything like this, or we haven't seen much like this. I mean, if you are, Joe Burrow's agent, you're the Bengals, you're Duke Tobin, Mike Brown, Katie Blackburn, you're looking at this whole mess going on in Baltimore, because we can call it what it is, a mess. What do you learn from that? And how do you apply those lessons to a Joe Burrow extension to make sure that, and not that you will have a repeat of that, but to make sure that you really nail down the details and keep your quarterback with a Brinks truck right behind, Paycor Stadium ready to pay him?
Yeah. To me, the number one thing you don't even have to worry about if you're Joe Burrow or the Bengals or a Bengals fan or whatever. And it's because Joe Burrow has an agent. Joe Burrow is represented. Joe Burrow is not representing himself. That to me, there are a lot of issues with that people have kind of discussed. And I mean, you can really take this in several different ways, but not having an agent, it creates a kind of a power struggle, because what is an agent there to do? It's there to represent you on your behalf, right? So if you're negotiating a contract, in your own daily life, if you're a football player or if you're a teacher or if you're an engineer, it doesn't matter. And you go to your employer, you kind of have to do this yourself, right? If you're not an athlete, you have to go to whoever your employer is and you have to say, I believe I am worth X, pay me X. And they tell you no. And sometimes, everybody's kind of experienced this, you get your feelings hurt a little bit. You kind of feel, you kind of feel disrespected. And that's, I think, kind of where we're at, I think, with this thing. I think, it has gotten a little personal because, Lamar has to go to, and especially when the money is this big and when status is so much more important, like when your money is public and your salary is public and everybody knows what you're making. And, it's kind of a, hey, this guy's making this guy's making that. I want to make this. Lamar is now in a situation where he had to go to the Ravens and say, again, he's disputed some reports. He's disputed a lot of this. He has to go to the Ravens and say, I want this. And the Ravens have to look their franchise quarterback dead in the eye and say, no, we don't think you're worth that. Like that burns some bridges just general because, right now, Joe Burrow could be quote unquote negotiating his contract and his agent could be on the phone with Duke Tobin and his agent comes back to him and says, hey, here's what we're thinking. And he goes, okay, well, I want this or that. And there's a middleman for that. And Joe doesn't have to focus on that. And that's a really big benefit. The second part of this that I want to touch on as I kind of rant here is I mentioned this at the top. Lamar tweeted on March 2nd that he requested a trade. And that was 25 days ago. And I believe, as I should have looked this up beforehand, but I believe that they slapped the non-exclusive tag on him on March 7th. So they knew that the trade request was there. And to me, what an agent is there to negotiate for you on your behalf and all of those things. And he's there to kind of be your contract liaison, right? Like everybody knows what an agent does, but what an agent also does is protect you and kind of serve as your PR guide. Because again, I mentioned this in the Bengals media room. I've kind of felt like Lamar was winning this PR battle because as soon as they slap the tag on him and all of a sudden you have all these teams come out of nowhere and say, oh, well, we're not interested in Lamar. We're not going to pursue him. We're not going to pursue him. Oh, the Commanders are out. The Falcons are out. This team's out. This team's out. It felt a little frankly, it felt a little fishy that within an hour, everybody was like, I don't know. And look, I get it. There were reporters for those various teams texting, hey, texting the GM, texting a scout, texting whoever in the front office saying, what's the word on this? It just felt very I'm trying to think of the word. It didn't feel right that you have a former MVP quarterback out there who's now available for the price of 2 first-round picks, with a contract extension, and nobody was interested in him. It kind of felt like everybody was like, why isn't Lamar that? Why isn't this? Why isn't that? You're only now learning about this stuff. You need an agent to be your PR front and to kind of be your representation in the media and to reporters and for interviews that he might want to do. And he's not getting any of that. And I know this is a rant here, but I'm not saying that you always need an agent. I genuinely think Joe Burrow could do this without an agent. He could walk into the Bengals front office and say, here's what I want. And the Bengals are more or less going to have to agree to it. But with Lamar, let
me pause you there real quick. Let me pause you there real quick, Andrew. Not to cut you off there. I'm sorry, but to pause real quick. Why do you think Joe Burrow could walk in and do that, but not Lamar?
Well, I think the situations are different, right? I think, with Lamar, there are some durability questions. Lamar hasn't finished the last 2 years because of an injury. You worry, again, I personally would have no problem with this. I mean, Lamar is 26. If I was a team like the Commanders or I'm trying to think of another team that would be close, like the Lions, I think should be all over this. If I was a team in that situation where I'm looking at this going, hey, we might be, a quarterback away from really kind of making some noise, especially if you're in the NFC. Where, who are the top 3 quarterbacks in the NFC? Jalen Hurts, Dak Prescott, Kyler Murray? I don't know.
Crazy.
There are certain things in the NFC that I would really be interested in. So in trying to make that move. So, I just think that, Joe is so meaningful to this city and to this franchise. And there aren't really really durability questions, kind of like there are with Lamar. You worry about, hey, if you sign Lamar to a 9-year deal, what is he going to look like years, 7, 8, 9 of that contract if some of his athleticism wanes, even if he stays healthy? Because what makes Lamar so great and so special is his ability to move and his ability to run. And if he loses some of that, you might be in trouble.
Okay, that's fair. No, and I'm actually glad you explained that, because I think a lot of people are looking at it as like, is Lamar just that crazy in the sense of he doesn't have an agent, which you could argue he is, or is it that he is just not like he's not built in the sense that he can go in there and look at Eric DaCosta and Ozzie Newsome and whoever else in the Ravens front office and say, I want this. And you made such a really good point, Andrew, of like, here's the thing that I think gets forgotten in all the noise is like, it's not easy to like look at your boss. In this case, I guess it'd be DaCosta and whoever's with him. Like, it's not easy to look at these guys and say, you're not worth this. You're not worth that. Like, you're going to take it personal. I mean, it really isn't, but in this case, it absolutely is going to be personal to Lamar, because it's not going through his agent, where the agent is sitting in the room and doing the negotiating. Because, I mean, obviously I've never sat in on these negotiations, but it's usually the agent that does the heavy lifting of like, well, he did this last year. He did X, Y, and Z. Like, that's my understanding of at least the semblance of what goes into those things of like, hey, he can do this in the fourth quarter. Other players at this value can't. Like, that's where a lot of that comes in. But when you're the one doing it yourself, and you're getting that piercing criticism of, well, you've been hurt, so we can't pay you this much, or, well, just because I'm hypothesizing, Deshaun Watson made this, but this is why it doesn't apply to you. Like, you're going to hear all that like he is, and he's going to go out on Twitter. And, I mean, like, you can just kind of tell he's giving it away, like, with the tweets he had. Like, there's one last week he had where, like, it was a Photoshop picture of, I think it was Ben Affleck with a Ravens jersey smoking a cigarette. And he was like, it's something about mental health awareness. I don't remember exactly what it was, but I think he's just trying to imply that like his head is just kind of full of everything. But like you said, though, it's kind of on him. He put this on himself. Yeah,
I think it's kind of a double-edged sword, because, with your own representation, you don't have to worry about it. But I mean, you do kind of get where Lamar's coming from in some of this, where, you look at the situation like, all right, Lamar in his first 5 years in the league has, a 45-16 record as a starting quarterback. That's really good. And then you look at a guy like Josh Allen, who's 52-24 as a starting quarterback. Josh Allen has made 2 Pro Bowls. Lamar Jackson has made 2 Pro Bowls and was an MVP. Like, there are kind of numbers, that can stack. I mean, and I'm not saying that, you would rather have Lamar over Josh Allen or whatever, but I think there are certain things that you can point to say like, hey, Lamar's got some of a case here. But in terms of things that I think, actually can be transferred over, and lessons that can kind of be learned by the Bengals and by Burrow and frankly by any other team is, you don't want this to extend this long. This is Joe Burrow has been eligible for a contract extension for, a few weeks now. Like, you don't really want to have this going on in, you don't want to have to, you don't want to have to say, that Joe Burrow is going to be playing under the 5th-year option in 2024, and then we're going to franchise tag him in 2020. Like, you don't want this to drag out. I think that's pretty fair. I don't think the Bengals would let it get to that point. And you certainly don't want to let negotiations become public. Joe Burrow is not really active on a ton of social media, but I can't imagine Joe Burrow is going to be, refuting reports on his own by saying, hey, this actually never happened. I never got offered this, or this was what they offered, actually, not this. Like, there are certain things that you can control. And I just think you can't let some of this get into the media. You can't let some of this kind of get out in the open. You want it all behind closed doors. And I think the Ravens would say the same thing. You want everything kind of in the conference room, in the war room, if you will. So, I think, the 2 big things are, the agent, you got one of them, you got one of those boxes checked if you're the Bengals and you're Burrow. But, the other 2, cannot let it go on this long. And you cannot let, hey, Joe Burrow turned down this amount of money. Hey, Lamar turned down this amount of money. Joe Burrow you can't do that. You have to let everything kind of stay behind closed doors.
No, I mean that's the thing is like luckily for Joe Burrow, I mean he's a very kind of low key, socially not out there kind of person like Lamar is. So very different personalities for starters. But I mean, this is not really a knock on Lamar, but I think Joe knows better. I mean, even if he didn't have an agent, I think he knows better than to go on Twitter and like start fighting with reporters or like quote tweeting reporters and refuting this and that left and right and having these like outlandish tweets. But Andrew, you laid out, all these really, I will say, well put examples of like how such a big situation can apply to even the most stable of places like Cincinnati, where like a Joe Burrow extension is the least of your worries, and similar extensions for other players in the future like Jamar Chase probably won't be much of a worry either. But the thing about Lamar is there's always something to be said about like any situation like this. Even if it's like in a place like Baltimore and you're in a place far away from there, like there's still something to be learned from this. And you laid out a lot of the learning lessons. And so, that was really well put. And I mean, that's just really scratching the surface of it. So really well said there, Andrew. Just to kind of wrap up here, not to take up too much time, but we've talked a lot about if the Bengals are going to bring back Eli Apple, what his future looks like in Cincinnati. I think we may have gotten a potential answer or at least a partial answer to that. And that is that the Bengals signed Sidney Jones, who last played with the Vegas Raiders, who was a free agent this offseason, signed him to a one-year deal. Hasn't really played, we'll say this, Cincinnati hasn't played well. He hasn't played consistent, has had a lot of injuries. Former second-round pick who spent the bulk of his early career with the Eagles. He was on their Super Bowl championship roster, but he did not play because of those injuries. So, I mean, you look at this guy, he's a journeyman. He's played in Jacksonville, Seattle, Philly, and most recently Las Vegas. Put up really good numbers his last full season in 2021 before he was traded to the Raiders. Do you think that the Bengals are looking at him as their Eli Apple insurance option? Or is he an insurance option behind who they hope would be Eli Apple on the roster? Like, do you think that move signals the end of, the end of Eli Apple's time in Cincinnati? Or
I think that you kind of can look at the way that the cornerback depth chart has kind of shaken out here over the last couple of weeks, and you've got Cheeto, you've got Cam Taylor-Britt, you've got Mike Hilton. Those are your top three. You've got Jalen Davis. You re-signed him. He's your backup slot. Then you've got Alan George. He's on the roster as well. Then you got Sidney Jones. And, again, you just kind of run out of numbers, because if you're going to carry three specialists and presumably, you would split the offensive and defensive, roster spots 25-25, or ideally you would. Well, you can't carry like 8 corners. And, like I said, I think this team needs another safety. I think you're going to add one in the draft. I think they're going to add a corner in the draft too. I would expect that kind of a middle round guy because, if Cheeto's not healthy to start the year, that kind of screams to me that, hey, look, here's a guy with, who's got some experience, who can play opposite Cam Taylor-Britt and kind of be that starter until Cheeto's fully healthy and fully ready to go. But yeah, I think that you can, unless something crazy happens where there's just like zero market for Eli Apple or for Trey Flowers, I think they seem ready to move on at this point.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned Trey Flowers because he's obviously more of a slot corner who, they put against tight ends and sub packages that they played during the year. I mean, for what he's worth, I'm surprised neither of them have gotten any offers. I don't think neither of them have visited teams, have talked to teams. I'm a little bit more shocked with Trey Flowers because I actually thought that he might get some interest elsewhere, but man, Eli Apple's in a tough spot. I mean, it looks like the Bengals are done with him, and then he hasn't visited anybody, like we said, at least reportedly that we know about to our knowledge. He's going to be 28 this year. He's played 7 years. It's not looking good for him. And again, I don't know if it's because people look at him like, yeah, he just doesn't have anything left in the tank, or if it's that mixed in with his social media is just toxic and we don't want him in our locker room, which there's already 2 other teams that feel that way that he played for. So I don't know how the other 29 teams, excluding the Bengals, feel about that. Who knows? But I think that signals the end of the Eli Apple chapter in Cincinnati. And yeah, I mean, I think that's just the best way moving forward for them. I mean, he's a veteran. Jones is. You know, he's proven that when he is healthy, he can play well, and maybe they want to take one more chance with him, and maybe he proves himself this year. So best of luck to him, and we'll definitely break down the defensive depth chart, you know, in the coming days and weeks to come. But stay with us this week. We're going to talk more about some of the biggest takeaways that Zach Taylor had at the owners' meetings this week in Phoenix as he spoke on Monday. We're going to talk more about the outlook of the Bengals depth chart, if they got better, where they got better, and much more bigger picture questions leading into the month of April. But once again, for myself and Andrew, I'm Muhammad Ahmad. See you on Tuesday.